On the first day of COP28 from here in Dubai, it's a fantastic pleasure to kickstart the Proof of Green conversation and do it with you, Orlando. You are sort of really an inspiration and we've been really dreaming this up together from a glimmer in the pupil's eye. So it feels very fitting that we inaugurate the COP28 explorations around greening blockchains and proof of green with a conversation with you. And it's where it all began. And now we are here in this incredible summit. So welcome, Orlando. And I wonder whether you'd introduce yourself and Carbon Crowd, and then we can carry on with the conversation.
Yeah, thank you for that introduction, and pleasure to be here. Looking forward to get into this conversation and share more about the vision of Proof of Green, what we're trying to do here, about our work at Carbon Crowd, and sort of more generally what we're up to. I can kick off quickly just with a brief introduction. I'm Orlando, the co-founder of Carbon Crowd. We are building towards a world where compute emits zero emissions. So we're really trying to push towards a world where we can run all this fantastic technology, run all this cloud infrastructure without it costing the planet. Yeah, that's what brought us to, well, Ismail and I together. That's what really is at the core of Proof of Green, and that will be the center of what we discuss today, I imagine.
Fantastic, thank you. And memory is a tricky thing. So I'll tell you how I remember things. And I'd love to know what it looked like from your end. So from where I was standing, I was already thinking that that obviously within the area of green computing and green software, blockchains have a terrible reputation, mainly from Bitcoin. And that's kind of the only two things that people tend to know about blockchains are, or maybe three things, are Bitcoin, money and fraud, and terrible environmental footprints. And then as you dig into, you add the fourth one for the people who are actually engaged in that space, and it's decentralization and societal transformation. And these four things are there, but really, unless you dive into it, you don't realize how diverse this ecosystem is, how innovative, how sort of environmentally, some of it is at the cutting edge of green software patterns, innovating at scale, and sort of a lot of it is definitely not on the other end. And so for me in the Adora Foundation, I had thought already, I'd really like to explore how to create tools and approaches to measure the emissions of blockchains in a transparent way. And I looked around, and the people who sort of jumped to my horizon thinking in very similar ways were Carbon Crowd. And I thought either they will not want to engage because they'll see us as rivals or competitors, or they'll get the Adora Foundation vision, which is that there are no competitors in this space, and that actually it is about how we catalyze each other's power. So I reached out to you to basically explore where you were in this journey. I had already been fascinated by the Internet Computer Protocol, this idea of creating an alternative internet on blockchain technologies, and had seen noises about efforts to measure its environmental impact. And I didn't know you were involved. So this is how I reached out. I thought, I'm trying to green blockchains and see how we measure this. I see you're interested in this. And that's where I came from. Now, what is your recollection of that encounter? from
Yeah.
your end.
Yeah, it's so funny to look back on that sort of initial meeting. From our side, and I mean, I guess I can give a little introduction to how Carbon Crowd came about because I think it's pertinent here. My co-founder and I, Hamish, technical lead, he's the CTO of Carbon Crowd. He has a background in cloud native computing and DevOps, really an expert in the compute area. And I had been working in startups, most recently before I started this, a fintech startup in London that sort of went through some hyper growth. And I'd been through this roller coaster. I was coming out the other side, and Hamish and I got our heads together and thought, how can we try and build something that's really going to make a difference. We started to explore sort of the tools and the problems that we thought we would use and that we thought we could maybe develop. And pretty quickly, all the tools that we were exploring, we wanted to build them in the most robust way possible. So we thought it doesn't make sense to build a tool that's allegedly decarbonization or making some kind of positive impact if we don't understand the impact of the tool itself, which led us to begin to try and measure the impact of the tool. And pretty quickly, we realized this was the real problem that we could try and set out to solve. This is something that's really difficult to actually get our heads around. Due to some of the connections I had in London at the time, the internet computer ecosystem was on my radar. And so we basically started to try and develop a proof of concept for the internet computer. We did this for about a year. We started off with an impact report, basically, where we tried to create a snapshot, static image of what the emissions of this network were over a period of time. And it took us a fair amount of time. There's quite a lot that goes into understanding digital emissions. I think it's quite different from, think about, the cement industry or the transport industry, where it's quite easy to understand how the emissions are created in that industry. But when someone's explaining to you that, more emissions in the airline industry is being emitted by data centers, which is collected through cloud to, the emails you're sending on your laptop, it's quite, nebulous concept. Anyways, so we'd worked on this for more than 6 months, I think, coming up on a year. And we got a message out of the blue from Ismail, who sort of said, "Hey, love your work." And we jumped on a call. And it was pretty clear from that first engagement that you'd been following our progress really closely, and that you knew a lot about this topic, and you really had, a lot of experience to bring and a lot of perspective that we had, great value for. And I think basically we haven't looked back since then.
Yeah, I mean, I remember, I think there was that sense of just a harmony of values. Basically, there is so much work in this space where either there is a deficit of trust or there's a kind of scarcity, competition mentality, etc. But the instant I had that conversation with both of you, it just felt that you were really sincere, that actually you really meant it. You really wanted to actually not just build a business, but green compute. And you're, you grew up in Africa. You have a perspective that is not just sort of global north centric in that sense. And I guess, I mention it because I suspect that is part of that unspoken stuff that happens in communication. Me here as a Mexican at the time in Britain, and just sensing that there is that harmony of values and direction. And you joined our incubation lab, and where we kind of sort of, I think it's been a really fantastic process and exploration. We had just started the incubation lab and had a few other projects that had won the Carbon Aware Compute Hackathon of the Green Software Foundation, and another fantastic company innovating in the web design space. And it was fantastic when you came through, and it seems that we basically it worked as well as it could have. We learned from each other and changed each other's trajectories in slight ways that somehow made both sharper. So What was that dimension like for you?
Yeah, it was definitely I think what's interesting for us to think back on is that, we started this company, and if we talk about sort of origins and we talk about Africa, so I started my journey in Kenya, and Carbon Crowd was actually conceived in Egypt. We were in Egypt when we had this idea. So funny how those things kind of fit together. But we you look back 2 years and people weren't having these conversations, and that's where we were trying to have this conversation. We were trying to shine light to this idea and trying to explain to people why it's important, and not only why it's important, but the huge potential, both environmentally but also financially. And we can get into that, the massive savings that this variability in grids can bring, and the huge opportunities it opens up. And actually, this conversation wasn't being had in the mainstream. Ironically, it was being had mostly in the Bitcoin circle, because it's so energy intensive, that the financial benefits are so clear, because you're running at such a huge capacity that a small marginal gain in your efficiency can actually lead to massive returns financially. So the crypto Web3 world was actually ahead because of necessity, and because of, in a sense, how damaging it was. And that's potentially another reason why we were drawn into this space. But I think for us, it was the fact that there was someone else out there who was looking at the same problem as us, who was understanding how important this problem was to solve, and also we have to solve this problem. There's no two ways around it. If you're going to make a bet on something happening in the future, the fact that compute capacity is going to become more important and more abundant is sort of undeniable. I don't think anyone's going to bet against digitization or bet against the use of compute to run these massive AI models that are coming out. Quantum computing, which is on the verge of probably a pretty massive breakthrough in the next decade. And so you're sitting there thinking, we need this technology to push forward, to drive our economies, to drive prosperity for the everyday person, but also to tackle some of the biggest problems on the planet. And we need a task force dedicated to making sure that it's not causing more damage than it's preventing. And that was really the from a very high level, the clear North Star here. We need to develop, and we came up with this idea of zero emission computing. It's just, how do we compute without emissions? Not by offsetting them, not by sort of trying to make them more efficient, which is obviously a journey, but actually getting to a point with, can you run compute without at least scope to emissions? And that's been sort of our guiding North Star since.
So that's very interesting. One of the things that I had in mind before I reached out to you was, it'd be great to create a dashboard that allows you to see that. And I was thinking about, how would I build it? And then I discovered that actually you were building it, and you've built it, and it's beautiful, as well as actually really powerful and informative, and a really sort of fantastic iteration on your report. So you did this impact report on the Scope 1 emissions of the internet computer, and that was published. But then you built on top of that and turned that into a dashboard for the internet computer protocol, which what is the link? If you want to say it, we can share it later, but just for if people want to check it out.
Yeah, app.carboncrowd.io is the dashboard. Definitely check it out. There should be some, well, we can get onto it later, but we're as you say, it's an iterative process. We released the report in September. We released the dashboard sort of Q2 this year. We've been conducting a huge amount of research and learning a huge amount and building, and we're hopefully ready to release the next version of it relatively soon. So keep an eye out.
So that's remarkable and really powerful, because it turns information into action, isn't it? So that was really, I spent a lot of years in Brighton University specializing in evaluation. And one of the things that sort of there's a lot of evidence for is that evaluation drives behavior, that what you measure shapes how you act, and what you don't measure often just sort of it's out of your mind in a different way. So, but a lot of these metrics that exist are really primarily informative, whereas you're kind of creating this tooling on top of your sort of rigorous methodologies to show these emissions in real time, in different regions, in different nodes. And there were elements about the way the Internet Computer Protocol is architected that made that easier than it would be for some other sort of blockchain implementations.
Yep.
And so that's what, and we'll come back to that. But that's really what made me sort of suggest, at least in my memory, but certainly sort of it came from our conversations, this idea of, well, it's great for the Internet Computer that they've got Carbon Crowd there. And maybe sort of Carbon Crowd will also sort of create these dashboards for all these other blockchains that are emerging. And if you do have a blockchain infrastructure project, I highly recommend Carbon Crowd as a partner to sort of tool up your sort of environmental metrics. But really, the challenge for me is that the language around emissions in blockchains is very variable. There is a lot of exaggeration of both its sort of horrors and its breakthroughs. There is some very good faith, accurate attempts to measure some of the bigger blockchains. And then there are really bad faith attempts at doing so as well. Mm-hmm. And it's really hard to kind of judge either as a sort of, somebody who wants to build in Web3, or as an investor, or as a regulator, and I think even potentially as sort of as a leader of a particular blockchain or a DAO, really where you are at environmentally and where are we going. And that's where the idea came to go beyond specific implementations, metrics, and toolings to exploring a collective chain agnostic consensus approach to how do we disclose and measure emissions that the industry could agree to as a whole, to be able to just sort of evidence clearly the successes, measure the progress, and speak with one voice to the world.
And hence proof of green.
And hence proof of green. So yes, what is your sort of perspective on that trajectory?
So naturally, there's, as you've mentioned, and as anyone who works in this space will know, there's just a huge amount to understanding environmental variables at a very fundamental level, right? And at a very accurate level. And that, when you sort of have increasing levels of abstraction across different blockchains, across different virtual machines within different blockchains, different digital structures, different physical structures, this becomes incredibly complicated, and it's a massive job to understand, even one of those networks, let alone many of them. And the idea of proof of green was to try and develop a language so we could actually draw some kind of useful comparison between them, and hold people accountable to a certain basic level of standards when they do this reporting. And maybe it's important to sort of understand why. And there's sort of two key areas that I see in why this is important. The first is the boring answer: regulation, right? When regulation comes, it's going to be very interesting. In theory, these networks are decentralized if we're talking about blockchains. But you can't just not report emissions or pollutes just because you have a decentralized structure. So how that is enforced and where that responsibility lies is going to be a fascinating, I think something fascinating to watch play out in the next 3 to 5 years. But maybe the sort of on top of that, what we're really excited about is the use cases. So we spoke a little bit about the report and then the dashboard. And the dashboard was really just a conversion of that static report into a real-time data analytics platform. Or not even platform, just data analytics tool. And so we were now running real-time electricity data, real-time electricity carbon intensity, price, electricity draw, server utilization, and kind of surfacing that on the front end. And what you have when what you open up when you achieve real-time emissions analysis is the ability to implement tools such as demand shaping, demand shifting, and all these kinds of ideas that require you to have a really fundamental idea of your data structure and sort of data and sort of how your data sort of reads. And that's basically what we set out to do at Carbon Crowd, right? We want to be able to implement the foundational data structures you need as a business or as a network, or as a company, to basically understand where you stand and then to take advantage of these use cases. And I'll give you sort of one example that's really pertinent right now, is that with the rise of renewables, and I'm sure that anyone who listens to this will be very, very well up to date on this, so excuse me if I'm repeating some things that people probably already know, but ultimately renewables are far more variable. The electricity profile of a grid is going to change throughout the day, which already impacts the carbon intensity, and it does impact the price in the wholesale markets. But that doesn't necessarily trickle down to commercial tariffs, electricity tariffs paid by medium-sized businesses, industries it does generally affect, but right now commercial level industries, and it certainly doesn't affect consumers yet. Now that's changing. Already the UK has released regulation that in 2025, basically all data centers, I think, and all commercial buildings, it might even be any commercial business, or any business rather, will need to basically pay for commercial priced electricity, sort of dynamically priced electricity. And when you're a data company, or when you're a company running a huge amount of compute, and you need to, and you're running that sort of agnostically, you're just sort of saying, send this, we spend a certain amount per kilowatt no matter what time we run this compute, it doesn't matter. When that regulation comes in place, when you run your compute is going to matter a huge amount, and it's going to actually fundamentally change the cost profile of your digital activities. And so suddenly you've gone from this world where it's nice to know about your green emissions because it's important to take a stand, and in some cases it's regulatorily required, to being it's actually maybe financially untenable not to understand the compute profile and the sort of emissions profile of your energy consumption. Maybe one thing to add there is there's a strong correlation between renewable energy abundance, sort of how carbon intensity of the grid, and the cost of electricity, because generally renewable energy, when it's available, is highly abundant. And so if you're consuming high or low carbon intensity energy, it's generally renewable, often renewable, and it's generally when energy is abundant. So these sort of two ideas start coming together, and that really drives the business use case in this sense, and sort of hopefully will push a lot of momentum into this market.
And that's, I guess, the next stage from your perspective in terms of that of tooling. So you began with this dashboard, and now you are essentially trying to go, okay, now that we have this information, how do we harness it in these usable ways to make decisions, to distribute compute, to potentially sort of find the sort of the optimal path, as it were, in terms of renewable electricity. So all of this you have been building within the context of the Internet Computer Protocol. Are you seeing beyond it at the moment as well to other areas, other blockchains?
Absolutely. Everything we build is chain agnostic as far as we can, or at least the foundational levels of it are. We sort of have, the internet computer ecosystem, and you touched on it earlier, has been an unbelievable incubation lab, and we sort of see it that way. Dfinity has been an incredible partner in this. They're such a talented team building an incredible product and really helping people in the ecosystem kind of find their feet and with the sort of information, data, resources they need. So it's been a fantastic breeding ground or training ground. But we need to have, if we want going to have an impact, we need to expand, we need to spread. So we've worked with a couple companies outside of the Web3 space, because there's a lot more of them, and we wanted to test those use cases. And we've got really positive results, and we're kind of confident now that we can do this at scale for a number of different clients. And now we're really hoping to spread this throughout the blockchain world, the Web3 world. Really say we can do this. This is something that drives a lot of value for you, and basically bring carbon-aware compute as more of a commonplace concept into the world of Web3.
So this is, I think, also a good opportunity to sort of delve into Dfinity's leadership in this, because I think the Dfinity Foundation, for those of you who are new to this, are the founders of the Internet Computer Protocol, that project to build an alternative internet on the blockchain. And Dfinity have really, I think, sort of before a lot of other blockchains sort of engaged with you in particular around sort of measuring their impact. And that's always a risk, because you never know quite what's going to come back. So that taking that risk and doing that well and giving you access to their infrastructure to be able to give them that data, I think showed sort of really significant leadership in that sense. And then they further invested in that fantastic dashboard. And they have also been really great supporters of this vision of proof of green, of this idea of going beyond just their own ecosystem and fostering some kind of consensus around standards. And again, that is something that I think cross-chain collaborations are tricky. They're tricky because that ecosystem is simultaneously mutually reinforcing and highly competitive. And so I've been also sort of very impressed by Dfinity's support of this idea. And they have been likewise sort of very strong partners for us with taking these conversations and turning them into this proof of green standard. And really, proof of green as an initiative is, I guess, the brainchild of the conversations that happened between civil society, social enterprise, not-for-profit foundation, organization, the Adora Foundation, technology, green tech, innovation business, Carbon Crowd, and the Dfinity Foundation as sort of drivers of a particular blockchain project. But I think by supporting this vision of proof of green, this vision of cross-chain consensus and standards, I think Dfinity and the Internet Computer are really, I think, stepping that leadership outside of their sphere. And again, it's something that is rare. They're not wanting to own it. They're saying, run with it. And I can say that sort of it's really beautiful that they chose, that this movement decided to say, okay, we want someone neutral, someone who's not involved in this space, the Adora Foundation, to shepherd the facilitation of this proof of green process so that it belongs to everyone. Yep. And we're willing to invest in that and support that beginning. So kudos to them. And at the same time, this sort of going back to what you just said, I guess, is this why you are interested in this cross-chain standard, in this element of sort of, as you're trying to build this in different ecosystems, what value does it add for you, the notion of some common agreement on the disclosure of emissions?
Great question, and one that I'm still trying to formulate the exact correct language to explain this concept that I think is potentially what sits at the center of our thinking at Carbon Crowd. But many people will have heard of the carbon markets, right? And for us, we feel like the carbon markets have been massively misconstrued. Not because I don't think that there's some value in carbon credits, if they're high quality, that's a whole different discussion. So obviously controversial, but more that the market really here for us is carbon emissions, not credits. Carbon debit, not carbon credit. That's the concept. Carbon debt. And if you can create, 1 ton or 1 kg, we try to work in smaller units. It's a bit more useful and a bit more maneuverable. 1 kg of carbon emitted from Ethereum, from Cardano, from Avalanche, from the IC is exactly the same. And if we can be sure it's exactly the same, then we can start implementing tools at a scale that tackles that treats this carbon that's been emitted in similar ways, and we get sort of economies of scale. We can start pooling those carbons into bigger pools and leveraging that sort of debt, that pool of carbon that people have a desire or an obligation to get rid of, and attract parties to deal with it, right? So sell access to that carbon pool to people selling renewable energy, whether that's tokenized or not. People selling services to decarbonize cloud networks, whether that's in Web3 or not. Same for carbon credits. And so this concept of generating what we're sort of terming the carbon economy, and it's really focused on carbon debits as a liability to the people producing it, but as an asset to a whole host of companies that are being created right now to deal with this carbon problem. That carbon debit sitting on your books, and this will really come to the fore in the next version of our platform. I think we're really trying to form the language here in what we're doing, and proof of green is a big part of that. But that carbon debit, as I said, it's a liability on someone's books, but it's an asset because carbon token providers can only sell that to someone or sort of execute a function of that against some amount of emitted carbon. And so there's an economy that's created by that. And the bigger we can make that economy, the more players it's going to attract to sell products and services into that economy, the higher competition, the better quality, the more accountability, and it creates this flywheel effect. And that sort of sits at the center of what we're trying to do. And I think that proof of green has a really, really big role in shaping that and saying this kg is measured and emitted and held in the balance against some entity. And it is equivalent, even though emitted from a different source, to this kg of carbon dioxide, the same characteristics, and can be treated the same. And that is fundamental to what we're trying to do if we're trying to do this at scale. And I really see that
as your prerequisite, in a sense. In order to be able to do that, you need to know that the kilogram of CO2 reported by Cardano is the same kilogram of CO2 reported by Bitcoin, by ICP, etc.
Has to be the same. Has to be. We have to have high confidence that it's the same, and then we can start doing really interesting things. And we're going to be testing a lot of these things in the ICU ecosystem over the next 6 to 8 months, which I hope that people follow along and contribute to if they want to, and hopefully in a number of different ecosystems too.
So this sort of allows us to explore actually sort of proof of green. So the Adora Foundation's role is design thinking and social innovation and community building. And so we understood this imperative for this common ground, and we understood that it wasn't there, that at the moment, sort of for an ecosystem that is based on trustlessness, all of the disclosures really rely on a huge amount of trust. Mm-hmm. And it's not easy, as you said. It's actually not easy to say this is a kilogram of CO2 coming from this compute. In fact, it's impossible, really, but it's, you can do it more or less rigorously. And there are lots of different approaches. And there are people doing fantastic progress in this space. But that common ground of metrics is a prerequisite to being able to say, how do we decarbonize the sector? And you've made a fantastic case from the commercial side. And I think it's also absolutely coming on the regulatory side. So this is something that in a podcast for sort of the Week in Green Software, for the Green Software Foundation, I did a review of the state of regulation. And I said, it's coming. And people don't know it's coming. We're like, it's going to happen suddenly. And those who have not prepared for it are going to be caught off guard. And
Mhm.
the EU has recently already commissioned 800,000 euros to explore how to measure the emissions of blockchains, and specifically the feasibility of developing standards for emissions disclosure. So this is absolutely unstoppable. So the question that we asked ourselves at the Adora Foundation is one of our design tools is this maximum unity across maximum diversity. Is that for this standard or this approach cross-chain to be meaningful, it has to be precise. It has to be transparent. It has to be science-based. But at the same time, for it to really scale, it has to be hugely flexible and hugely dynamic and account for an enormous amount of diversity. It also has to be minimally prescriptive. It has to be prescriptive enough to be meaningful again, to create some common ground, but it can't be so prescriptive that you decide consequential versus attributional and take a stand that basically just means you're one more specification out there. So the concept that we came up with at the moment and that we are validating and will be validating here with you in these conversations and beyond is inspired by the approach taken in software toward APIs. So the open API specs and the async API specifications, those are two in which I had quite a lot of involvement or engagement with, rather, particularly async API. And it's a similar thing. Describing a computer system can't be very prescriptive because they're so diverse, but it has to be standardized enough for completely alien systems to talk to one another and for people to have a common language. And the way that they arrived at it, Open API specification, for those of you who are not familiar with this, is essentially a document that sets out a format for describing RESTful APIs, the most kind of conventional APIs, the way different computer systems and softwares talk to one another. And async API was a way to describe event-driven, trigger event systems that were not adequately captured by REST APIs and Open API. But the thing to extract from this is that they involve a minimum set of fields that have to be completed to describe a system. And then they provide for extensions to those fields, and they have a common language for those fields. So taking inspiration from that, the idea that we've come up with is to identify a minimum viable standard for emissions disclosure. So you can measure emissions through 3 scopes with life cycle analysis, or you can measure emissions in just scope 1 by proxy, or you can measure emissions by going to a website and saying, tell me my emissions of my website. So what would be the basic common ground that would accommodate diversity, consequential and attributional approaches, that would accommodate very thin implementations for people starting on their journey, and complete metrics like those of CCRI at the gold standard metrics? How do we create this common language that everyone can embrace and that others can leverage? So I wanted to ask what your thoughts are about this approach, about the approach of having essentially a template that tells you to describe some core components of your emissions measurements and metrics that allows you to describe your approach and allows people to judge, how detailed or not detailed they are, was giving you enough freedom to experiment with different methodologies. Would that be universal enough and specific enough to contribute to being able to consider 1 kilogram of Cardano emissions and 1 kilogram of ICP emissions equivalent enough, not exactly equivalent, but equivalent enough to build a kind of markets that you're talking about?
I think it's a question of balance and trade-offs always with all these things. I think that it's definitely a prerequisite. We need to have standards. That's obvious. We definitely need to have standards. The method that you're describing has proven successful historically, and I think it's always worth, that we don't need to reinvent the wheel here with these things. So I think that the approach makes a huge amount of sense. I think that within that, that doesn't necessarily solve the problem of trust, right? Because you still have to have a confidence level that's coming through. You could send through electricity readings, you can send through life cycle assessments, but ultimately you got to trust someone has, something has input that number, and that's difficult to verify if that's true. So there's a lot of work to do here. In figuring out the model that everyone can usefully use. Like, let's make this useful for people as opposed to burdensome. And then once we have the model, how do we improve it? How do we, there should be a way you could have a gold star metric with the most basic inputs if you validate to a high enough level of certainty each of those inputs. This doesn't have to work. We need to try and simplify it at least, and then move down the scopes: scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, and figure out, all the way down the line how we can actually incorporate in this into some kind of standard that everyone can follow and everyone can understand. This is definitely a journey, right? Like, I think that's important to stress as well. We're not going to come out with a standard or a set of standards and that's gonna sit tight forever. I think it's, you give a best effort and then you bring people in. And that is another reason why I think Proof of Green is so important. Is it's a neutral territory where everyone can come and contribute to the benefit of everyone. And that's, the academics, the Web 2 world, the Web 3 world, we need to, the electricity markets. How does the electricity markets work in this? Electricity, computer, sort of inseparable from each other. So it's critical to be iterative. It's critical to get as many people as we can involved so that everyone can have a say. And it's critical to have a structure that guides this over a long period of time, that we can actually take this project forward for a long enough period of time to sort of set these standards. So I'd say I think those are sort of a few of the pieces that we need to fit together and find out how, how they fit into the Proof of Green vision.
So there's some really powerful concepts there that are definitely core to our vision. So one is that we're not reinventing the wheel. So actually there are standards. We're not inventing standards. When you did your impact report, you drew on a body of evidence and standards, and they're growing. The ICO is adding some more. The International Telecommunications Union, the ITU, which is the United Nations sort of technology organ, is also doing enormous work behind the scenes that's about to come out on standards for measuring and greening compute. There is a lot of work, and the fundamentals, I think, are well understood as well. So we're not reinventing the wheel in that sense. And therefore, Proof of Green should not aim to be a standard in the sense ISO is a standard that prescribes all you need to do in order to meet it, but rather a standard for a format, for a way of communicating how you're using all these existing standards, how you're using all these existing metrics. So that takes us to the second element, which is that it is not a replacement for trust, it is an advancement of trust. So it is not the solution to trust. I don't know whether I believe absolute trustlessness is possible in general, but that is certainly a contribution, right? All of these things are part of this iteration. So, but having a transparent framework for how you speak and how you disclose, for how your apple is described as an apple and is not an orange, that does create sort of a much clearer ground for that trust, which takes us to a third element, which I think you also raised, and it's that it's also iterative and not final. That the idea is that we just move forward one step at a time. We improve, which is what we do in tech all the time. So we go for version 0.0, then 0.1, then version 1. And we don't do it by thinking abstractly, but by iterating in between what is sort of optimum and what is doable, and doing it again and again, kind of thing. And the last bit that I think you mentioned that is also absolutely critical to our vision, it's why I think sort of we have sort of stepped up to host this process, is that it has to be neutral, that it cannot be owned or sponsored by one blockchain or by one government or by one philanthropist, that whatever the sort of resources come into this process, the standard itself should be seen as belonging to no one and to everyone, and have the mechanisms that ensure that in a transparent, trustless way, where you have the constitutional elements that say this belongs to the community. And there's an interesting sort of model in chip manufacturers, for example, where there's this NGO that agrees to co-patent everything so that they're not all competing for patents. And it's seen as this neutral space in which to develop. So I'd like to think that Proof of Green can be that space where competing methodologies, competing standards, competing blockchains, competing technologies, NGOs, everyone can find that minimal common ground that can go further. And then the last bit that I think you raised, and it's one that maybe one day will come, but that for us has been really very emphatic to steer clear of, is the validation element of it. For Proof of Green not to be a proof of green in that sense. You don't get this certificate that says, and now you're green, you're gold or you're silver, in that sense, from Proof of Green itself. That Proof of Green should not be an arbiter of who's doing well and who's doing badly. That we need external arbiters to do that. But Proof of Green should provide the language by which those arbitrations are made. So it's not for, because otherwise it becomes content, it no longer becomes neutral. We're taking a stake on saying you are greener than someone else. Whereas the goal is to say, make your claim. This is how you make your claim. And this is the framework for making your claim. And now it's up to you and others to prove it, as it were. But at least we've agreed on how that claim is made, what the standard is for that communication. Does that sort of capture the sort of what you were kind of?
Yeah, I think that that's a good intro to sort of, it helps with the understanding of what Proof of Green is setting out to achieve, and the sort of complexities and the challenges and the opportunities that it will produce.
And so I guess the last question maybe is what's next? So if Proof of Green is to be this shared space that does not belong to any one partner player, even subtly, even indirectly, not ostensibly neutral, but really neutral, then it has to be represented and owned by everyone. And this idea has been growing. It's been growing from sort of, hey, should we have some standards, to Carbon Current Under Our Foundation saying, yes, we like it, to Definitely Carbon Crowd and Azure Foundation saying, yes, we like it. Professor Rennie from MIT has also said, hey, I really like this idea. I want to back it. And we're now having these conversations throughout COP28 and beyond with other stakeholders in the system. I know sort of Professor Van der Van Houde from Glasgow University was saying how he'd love to host an academic event in Glasgow with all the blockchain specialists that are around this. So there's this room for community building.
Yeah.
And my vision would be that we build a coalition of people who see merit in this vision and who help it land in some kind of institutional form and specification form. So from your perspective, who do you see buying into Proof of Green, and how do you see that community building process evolving and crystallizing into something usable in the coming months?
I think there's a couple of different players that we really need to get involved in this, or that would really drive this forwards. I think that the blockchain foundations themselves are the obvious sort of standard bearers of their communities, and that if they are basically saying, yes, we're going to step up and take the initiative to try and standardize any reporting that anyone else wants to do within their network, make that data available, because in a lot of the cases that data is not available. What this does, and what's interesting about the blockchain world, is actually the ability to do this in many cases lies potentially more with the node operators than it does, in fact, with the protocol itself. And I think that's really important. Node operators, people running the compute, actually operating the servers, in some cases, are the only people who actually can deliver the kind of data that we need to generate these kinds of insights. So shout out to all node operators out there. Anyone, basically running any of this compute for chain or for Web2, you are a key component in this, and we really want to have you involved. And understand, basically how we can help you. The dynamic electricity prices is going to be such a game changer that it's difficult to even describe it. The billing model of how much your AWS architecture costs cannot be a standard flat fee if it no longer is only based on usage of the compute. It also now is going to have to factor in when that compute was used. That is going to feed across the blockchain, because you're running a blockchain, but suddenly you sort of start moving what was sort of a fixed input, and suddenly that becomes a dynamic input, and that fundamentally changes this industry. It's going to disrupt everything. It's going to take a bit of time. This is going to be on the years scale. Probably within a year things will start looking very different. Within 2 years things are going to look very different. In 5 years they're going to be completely unrecognizable. We have to start now if we want to be prepared. Many people won't start now, that's for sure. We can be certain of that. But if you want to have a pretty low cost, low effort, rather way of being involved and staying up to date, even if nothing else, then I think Ismail's leading a really exciting project with Proof of Green. There's some interesting people, as you mentioned, who are already backing it, and it'd be looking forward to what the next year brings for Proof of Green.
Thank you. And that was a fantastic point. Professor Rennie also made it. The critical role of the node operators in this discussion and in being part of Proof of Green. And there's obviously also the regulators we need to engage with. But sort of this is really a great place to finish. I'll ask you one closing question, which is what would be your hopes for COP28? We've got people now addressing sort of, I think that the biggest element of hope that's going to be celebrated, perhaps even hyped, celebrated fairly and justly, is the dramatic acceleration in the expansion of renewables. That is the fastest progress we've made in any area of the Paris Agreement, I think, and is intimately connected to the new models of carbon pricing and electricity pricing that you're mentioning. and will become more and more and more so. So in general, and within that context, what do you think, or what do you want to happen at that sort of global level, whether it be at the state and policy level, or from the people, the industries that are here in COP, to ensure that that transition you're saying is about to revolutionize everything in the next 2 years is effective and responsible and fair?
I have a long wish list from COP, so I'll have to choose. I'll have to choose one of them. And I suppose in the context of this discussion, I think there's a couple things. I think that the UK making this decision about the dynamic energy prices is critical. Demand response is a hugely effective way of and I think that's the first time we've used that term. We probably should put that in the beginning, because if you want to understand the general umbrella this all sits under, it's demand response. Enabling that technology and that capability to take flight, which requires, in the same way that it took us a bit of time to get our heads around the idea that you can't just switch on and switch off a coal power station, and renewables are going to have slightly different effects on our power grids, on our lives, on how we produce electricity. We are going to be forced to have a fundamental reorganization of how we consume electricity. And we're trying, when you do the calculations of what it would take in terms of battery power to basically not, based on our current energy systems, if everything was renewable and we made up with the gap with batteries, the capacity required is insane. When you start introducing smart functionality into devices, into servers, into workloads to shift demand around the day, then we can start achieving the same goals with just a staggering amount less investment, a lot more sort of data innovation, as opposed to just churning out batteries. So I think that a real push to enable demand response to come through would be in relation to this my top request. I think that there's a big focus on food chains and food production in this COP as well. I think that is just critical. We need to figure out how to stop having such an impact on our planet in terms of our food systems and our consumption of foods around the world and our habitats. As you mentioned, bringing it full circle, I'm from Africa. I've watched Africa over the last 20 years just completely change. Many things for the better. I mean, it's just booming in terms of the tech scene, unbelievable. But the animals and the climate and the habitats, let's say, have taken a massive hit. We need to find ways to restore that. So long wish list for COP. I'm gonna watch with bated breath. But it's been an absolute pleasure to discuss this with you, Ismail, and looking forward to welcoming some people who want to get involved in the coming weeks, and to seeing what outcomes we can pull off.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Orlando, for a fantastic conversation. It's been really inspiring, informative, and like you. So kudos to Carbon Crowd, and thank you, Orlando, and fantastic luck on the next iteration of your work. And all the best.
My absolute pleasure. Yeah, thank you so much. It's always a pleasure. Thank you. Bye.